Welcome to Unmoored, America adrift in historical forgetfulness and finding our way back. In this show, we dig into the societal upheavals in recent U.S. history that have left so many feeling lost, angry, or hopeless, and explore how our nation became so unmoored. At the heart of this upheaval is a major debate over how to build a society where everyone can thrive. Our host is history professor and theologian Carl Kriesman. Joining Carl is Matthew Porter, a writer, director, and creative executive.
Hey, Matthew, how's it going, buddy?
Hey, Carl, doing all right.
I like it. Well, we've kind of arrived at the end.
Yeah. Episode 10?
Episode
Is that
10.
possible?
I know. We have had, it has been so much fun kind of working our way through.
Yeah.
And trying to lay out, and just as we dive in one sense, this is the last episode.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, ta-da!
Boom.
And we are going to have one more, sort of a bonus episode. I mean, it's sort of planned, but where I want us to talk together. Sometimes people listening may go, well, it's too much of Kriesman talking.
Mm-hmm.
But I want us to talk together about, like, well, with this information, with what we've talked about, with what we've laid out, what are some possible solutions? But I do want to set everybody's expectations properly. There's no, like, I'm going to pull the curtain away and go, ta-da, this is really the answer, because that's not ever been my journey here. Instead, well, my observation of the country, at least the last 20-ish years, I think the data completely supports this, is that we've got a problem. The country's in peril. Some people think, if we just choose better leaders, that'll be the answer. I disagree. I don't think that's the point. I think our issue gets into spiritual questions and spiritual internal issues. There's some who we've kind of laid out as a character of the sort of the conservative or the conservative Christian who thinks if we would just really institute a much stronger Christian faith, even to the point of what I say they're saying or asking for is like Christian nationalism, they would probably, many of them, refute that'll solve things. Again, I don't think that's the answer. There's others who think, well, if we just remove or silence or at least minimize kind of religion, the old dogma, superstitions, don't need any of that. And what I've said instead is that if we could focus on the missing historical truths from our both national history in particular, but then the sort of foundational history, they would give us information that I've said are like necessary stances, positions, foundational elements of what had previously made the United States a healthy civic society. And as we've said more than once, not a perfect society,
right?
Not triumphalism, not American exceptionalism. We're this utopia. But still, extraordinarily, in the annals of human history, one of the most successful civic entity attempts in world history. And we pull that off. So you say, well, if things are bad now, what's happened? And again, I'm saying the solution lies in history. So our previous 6 episodes, so we laid out that as an intro in the first 3 episodes. Mm-hmm. And then in episodes 4, 5, 6, and 7, we talked about antiquity. So we looked in those episodes, the last 6 episodes, kind of the history of our society. Again, 4, 5, 6, and 7, kind of looking at antiquity, kind of how that provided a foundation for what we would probably today call Western society, but for the United States. And then in episode 8 and 9, we considered the USA's history narrowly in its colonization, a moment where we could see what the first colonists may have thought of as a situation. 1776, when we had both our very famous Declaration of Independence and our often ignored and not paid attention to first governing document. So what did they say there? Right. And today we kind of arrive at this moment where we look at our second and now our continuous. So I think it's I'm going to get the math wrong. It's like almost 240 years of continuous governing document, the Constitution. All right, so
nice.
So here we are, the Constitution. I guess somebody could continue the examination post-Constitution, but what we're saying is we think in our history there's something foundational that was unique, that the people who set it together, and I don't mean just the 55 men in Philadelphia in 76 or the 39 men who signed the Constitution. I mean the 2 million-ish men and women who were setting this thing in motion, what they were thinking, expecting, and what they ultimately concluded to do that laid things out. All right, is that good? You feel
that's good? Listen, I watched Hamilton for like the 25th time this weekend. So my mind is already in this kind of space. So I'm primed and pumped and ready for this.
Awesome. Okay, so let's set the context. We saw in 76 that the leaders of the country meeting in Philadelphia made some plans, and they created a committee to write a governing set of documents. That gets passed in 77, ratified in 81 at roughly same ballpark as when the Battle of Yorktown happens. And you could say from 77 on, formally, and from 81 on, we have a set of governing rules. I kind of wish our next one wasn't called the Constitution, because Constitution's a noun.
Yeah, it's more of a 2.0.
Yeah, exactly.
Versus, here's this new thing. Like,
Yeah, we have a Constitution.
not.
It's called the Articles. Then we have a second Constitution that we unfortunately called the Constitution, made it a proper noun. So it's a little confusing. But in the 1780s, there's a debate about whether the Articles were being successful or not, and it's a much longer story, which we won't dig into. But the complaint was it wasn't very strong, or it wasn't successful.
Now, when you say it's not strong, was that by design and that was it to itself, or was it more of a provisional? It's weak by design for now, and we're going to circle back to this. And
Yep. Nope. It's the first part.
it's the first one.
It's not a flaw. It's a feature.
Yeah.
It's an intentional feature. And if you'd ask Dickinson, who created it, if you'd asked the early leaders, maybe the one person who might have been unhappy with it was John Adams, because he believed that there should be at least a bicameral legislature. He actually believed there should be an executive. He's saying a lot of the same things Montesquieu says, and they kind of say them independently of each other. They need to divide power up. However, that's not what the Articles thought, and was not the mindset of the founders. Again, some of this gets into their view of the 13 states as being independent. So remember, state can be nation, can be empire, can be tribe, can be city-state, dictatorship, all those kinds of terms we use to describe a political entity today that we typically only today say nation.
Right.
So it's almost better to say there was the 13 nations who were creating a confederated nation, almost like we think of the EU today, that the EU in Europe kind of sets things up like that.
Their states were different than what we perceive.
Right.
Same word, different.
Exactly.
Different understanding.
And so they when you get to the question, if you really dig into the question of power relative to the Articles, and you're thinking, well, why didn't they have more power? They would have said, we do have power. It's in the nation of Virginia. It's in the nation of New Hampshire. So, for instance, and this was a critique from Adams as well, that they don't have a national judiciary. And they largely would have said, why would we? Why should somebody in Georgia sit on a bench for a national judiciary to answer what's happening in Connecticut? Connecticut and Connecticut citizens deal with that singularly. Now, there may be other questions that could arise from that relative to what if somebody from Georgia was in Connecticut, and then a whole bunch of other things. And the question that's being raised by some young leaders like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, who you already mentioned, they're saying, well, wait, are we 1 or are we 13? And that was a question that they were answering. To go back to our episode, we looked at the colonization. None of the colonists believed themselves to be establishing a nation. And when the first people, like Ben Franklin in the 1750s, were talking about maybe we should somehow unite in some way for our benefit of all of us living here, and he didn't even mean it to be independent, even the idea of a united something in North America was poo-pooed by most of the other people. Like, no, that's we don't need to go down that road. So again, 1770s, I mean, through the war itself, you probably have, it's hard to get the numbers on it, but no, I'd say a running total between, say, 25 and 45% of the citizens were opposed to the patriots, as we call them. They would have said the rebels, because they were trying to ruin their country and throw us into this confusion of some new fangled idea that nobody can really explain called something. And remember, it was John Dickinson in the Articles who first used the phrase United States. Right. So these guys who we call the loyalists, they were being loyal to the country. And they're like, we don't need to leave this thing. So when they do create it, the idea of power, people felt more comfortable about saying, well, the power really resides at the level of New Jersey and at the level of Maryland. And yeah, we'll have some sharing. But again, there's the critics like James Madison and others who are like, yeah, I'm not going to go down that road. And George Washington is somebody in that ballpark also. He was beginning to have concerns. Adams is in London. Thomas Jefferson's in Paris. they're also having concerns, mostly because it seems to them that most of the European nations, which were the leading nations in the world, did not respect the new country. And they didn't respect us kind of diplomatically, and they didn't respect us financially. So like, you know what, maybe we have not positioned ourselves in a strong enough stance to garner what we want. So eventually, Madison will lead a successful move in 1787 to get a new constitution written. It's important for everybody to realize this is opposed immediately by some of the rock stars of the Revolution: Sam Adams, Patrick Henry, John Hancock. And there are many others. When you get into, say this later, when you get into the ratification, probably about 45% of the country voted's too strong, but that's the word we would understand today, voted against the Constitution. So it barely passes when they pass it. So this sets up this kind of battle, over how much power should be in the government. Now that's not our focus. Our focus is obviously, turns out to be last moment. So we haven't written a new government. If we wrote a new constitution at some point in our 240 years, then you and I would talk about that in another episode. So this is the constitution we have. It's still our constitution with some amendments, but not actually as many as people think, that we've had. And so this gives us our last chance to kind of question, well, what were the founders thinking about what was necessary for this civic foundation? And as we've been talking about, we want to say, what did they include? And based on the characters that we've had and the fact, again, that I think our current tension is a spiritual question, did they think that? Did they try to protect the country by having no religion, no Christianity at all? Did they say, we're going to enshrine it in and make it national law, and maybe that would be to the support of modern people today who think we should go back to that? All right?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, before we talk about what happened in Philadelphia, I think it's useful for us to pause, since I've mentioned the power of the states, and say, well, what was happening at the state level, right? So once 1776 happened, and I mentioned this in that episode, that there was a moment when the Second Continental Congress basically passed a resolution that said to each of the states, you need to declare your own independence. And then later, the guys in Philadelphia did a united thing, which is our declaration. From that moment on, 12 of the 13 colonies, now we'll call them states, rewrote their own governing documents. So they created a new constitution for themselves. So it's very interesting to see this kind of juxtaposed against what happens at the national level. So it's a mixture of how they perceived what needed to happen. 4 of the states required an oath of office, an oath for office, for any level of office, that included an open confession of their Christian faith. That's in their Constitution in 76. And it's 76 and after. Some are 77, 78, but in that ballpark. 5 of the states had a requirement, although there's nothing stated, so there's not an oath, but there's a requirement that just says that the members who do get elected to state level representatives will be a member of a Protestant church, or a few of them say the person has to openly state they're Christian. But there's nowhere in the document that I could see that said how. So 4 of them, they're like, there's an oath, it's written out, this is the oath you will say, and it's very clear. So it's a religious stated oath. It's a Christian stated oath. And I guess I should pause there and make sure everybody realizes at this point, when they're saying religion, they're thinking about it narrowly within Christian denominations. They are not thinking at this point in terms as we would think today. If we said there should be religious freedom, we're thinking of our Hindu friends, Buddhist, atheist, secularist, anybody who has anything would fall under that arena. They are not thinking that. It's probably to our benefit that they did use the word religion rather than Christian. But again, some of these are pretty specific to say Christian or even Christian Protestant, meaning they're excluding our Catholic Christian friends. Then there are 4 states that have no mention of religion at all, either by just silence, or some of them take steps to kind of say, we don't want to do that in some other documents that they have. South Carolina is interesting because it actually, they wrote a document in 76. They then changed it in 78. When they changed it in 78, they included, quote, the Christian Protestant religion as the state's religion. So in one sense, unless I'm misreading it, South Carolina is the only state of the 13 that said we have a state religion, but they did broaden it not into a specific Christian denomination, but all of the Protestant groups in the process. Various states will follow Maryland 1649, and then we talked about Rhode Island also in that time period. They will have a stance in the document that talks about nobody should be persecuted relative to their type of worship. So there's a difference, you could say, in the Constitution between what's expected of elected officials and then what's happened on the ground. And then there were some states that actually included a tax on all citizens. Now, this is a thing that was happening basically everywhere else in the world. So no matter where you were and which time it's placed, most of the time the state and what we call the religion, we said this last episode, are one thing. And so the idea that there'd be an expectation of all the citizens defending this was one of the changes we saw that Constantine made, that after he declares Christianity the national religion for the Roman Empire, a tax was instituted empire-wide that was to fund, which was just changing the tax that had previously been paid for all the other temples and religions in the polytheistic Roman religion pre-Constantine, kind of a thing. So there were 3 states for sure that did that. There were a couple other states that talked about it that never really implemented it. All right, so you can kind of see the states have taken to our conservative Christian friend today. They could look back and say, see, told you, the states did these things.
Right. And that's I haven't heard that before. That sounds like, that feels like a bridge beyond where I thought we landed on certain things. Like, and
it raises questions for us.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so we need to think about what that means. Some of that, I think, reflects this viewpoint of the Articles, which, remember, we said is sort of a John Lockean position of the state can do it at once. Mm-hmm. And so they're thinking that's good. And there's a mixture in that, right? So there's one, if I'm reading it properly, there's one that says, hey, this is it, but even their choice of a stated state religion is still broad. There's others that have an oath of office. And there's some that don't really say anything, like they don't want to include it. It's not part of their mix. And there's concerns about tolerance. So they're kind of in that ballpark. But it's reflective that there was, as we've said, this Christian ethos. So to our progressive character who might think, Christianity should be, would be banned or be marginalized. Well, clearly it's not at this point. It's still, as I said, one of the 4 founding themes that is deeply embedded throughout the citizenry. Even the 4 states that don't have anything, it's not like they were secular states and did not have faith. The Great Awakening, which is a whole other topic, but it's a moment of great spiritual Christian revival, had happened in the, say, roughly 1740s to 1760s time period. So this was very fresh on everybody's mind. So their view of Christianity was quite high in the process. Now, I want us to look quickly at 2 specific states, Massachusetts and Virginia, because they're both useful for us. Obviously, Virginia, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe. Massachusetts, John Adams. John Adams is, in my opinion, the country's leading constitutional thinker. I think it's one of the great sadnesses of the creation of the Constitution that he was not in Philadelphia. Madison was his equal. I don't think Madison's stronger. Others do. But if you have these 2 titans of constitutional thought, I think it would have been really good for them to both be in the room, but they weren't. But John had written so much about constitutions that when you think about constitutions, it's hard to think well of what the Americans were considering without John Adams. And of those names I just mentioned, he would have been the most fervent in his religiosity, in his Christian faith, active and a participant, whereas the others would have been more tepid in theirs. So Virginia they actually write a constitution in 1776, and they say nothing about religion, so they're in that group. But that doesn't mean they didn't have leaders. Patrick Henry is one of the leading voices of Virginia, again, one of those rock stars of the Revolution. He will, by the way, oppose the Constitution. And he and others in the leadership, they wanted, for there to be a strong position about the Christian faith. In 76, they also will pass a Declaration of Rights, which gave everyone equally entitled to the free exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience. So there's a call for tolerance early on. There's no tax for religion, but there had been previously in the colony, because again, it was part of England. Everybody did this. So Patrick Henry and others wanted to bring this back. And really, I think Henry would have wanted to be in a state like South Carolina where we put it specifically in there, or putting Jesus first, God first, that kind of a thing. But he's got other thinkers in Virginia, again, like Jefferson, who are deeply opposed to this. And that's not saying Jefferson is or is not a Christian. We're trying never to say that, you and I. That's not really our bailiwick to get to make that declaration. But Jefferson certainly would have been someone who was more on the Enlightenment thinking of the rationality of the human mind, and one maybe not needing to have any need for like a divine guidance in the process. When I mentioned the Great Awakenings, one of the things that is beginning to happen in all 13 of the states is that you are beginning to have larger Christian minority groups, so other denominations. Remember, when we started off, you had the Puritans in one spot, you had the Quakers in another spot, you had the Catholics in another spot, you had Anglicans in a different spot. And now, because we've had this 150 years run, people have come from all over, and they bring different things with them, and they take those faiths with them. So in Virginia in particular, you have a growing minority group called the Baptist, and then the Presbyterians are a smaller group after them. And there's already been open persecution against these minority groups because the leaders, in a somewhat typical move for a state, meaning a nation, a civic entity, if we're going to have a faith position of X, then it's X and X only. And anybody who differs from that will be banished or punished. And there were on the laws, and it happened in practice, laws about what should happen. There was arrests, there were jailings, there were some beatings in the jailings as punishment. Wow. There was also kind of a social pressure against. And again, so think of this as Christians who are in the majority stepping in and saying, we don't like you, other Christians who are in the minority. And so like there'd be, the Baptists would be doing, there are stories of this, of them having like a baptism in a river, and somebody else like seeing it and like driving their wagon or riding their horses right into the middle of that and blocking and interrupting and hitting and knocking people over. So there was a lot of social pressure.
Yeah.
And it was this social pressure that Madison and Jefferson in particular are like, okay, that's not cool. Like, we shouldn't be that kind of a place. So that will lead them, now Jefferson at this point specifically is in Paris, but that will lead them to pass the Virginia Religious Tolerance Law. It's an act regarding religion, and it was passed about a decade later in the 1780s, 1786. And in it, it says this: no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious service, place, or ministry whatsoever, nor shall be enforced, restrained, molested, or burdened in his body or goods, nor shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or belief, but that all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinions in matters of religion, and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities. Meaning you can have whatever faith position you want, you have the freedom of speech with it to maintain by argument, and it won't have any negative against your ability to vote, own property, whatever your position is. And so this passes in Virginia. So they have this stance where they say, we want to be like our neighbors, Maryland, a place of tolerance. We understand Christianity is important, and we don't want to diminish Christianity, but we want to open the door for a plurality of viewpoints in the mix. It's a really big deal. Jefferson saw this as one of his most important things that he contributed to, and he put in his will that if there's any memorials allowed for me, this is one of the few things that he would allow, that he wanted to be on like his tomb or in the memorial for that kind of a thing. Massachusetts, where John was, so they tried to write a constitution in 77. There's a longer internal state thing. Adams and others had warned the way that was attempted would fail, and it sure enough did. So they actually are the first state, and maybe arguably we could say first globally, but certainly the first state to have what we call a constitutional convention. So in other words, you have a legislature, they're elected, they obviously have power. Adams and other people's viewpoint was like, don't ask them to write the laws. Have a whole separate group. Let each neighbor and village and place elect somebody to go to a separate room. So John was one of these people chosen from his hometown of Quincy, or not his hometown, but where he lived in Quincy, which is right outside of Boston. And so he was asked to go, and then ultimately he becomes the person who really is the principal author of the Massachusetts Constitution, which is still in existence to this day. Massachusetts will tell you that this is the longest lasting continuous Constitution. It also has been amended, but it's the same one that John wrote and then was ultimately passed in 79 and 80 in the process. So it's interesting when you look at the Massachusetts one. So again, Massachusetts, that's the home where we saw the Pilgrims and the Puritans. So two very strong religious groups.
Yeah.
It kind of birthed out Rhode Island and Connecticut as a religious birthing of things, obviously in opposition to some of the stances by the Puritans, but kind of a big deal there. John Adams made the decision that the very first thing in their Constitution would be a Bill of Rights. So he starts right out of the gate with a listing of the rights of citizen. And in Article 2, it states that the citizens have a duty, quote, to worship the supreme being, the great creator and preserver of the universe. However, religious freedom is enshrined in that, quote, no subject shall be hurt, molested, or restrained in his person, liberty, or estate for worshiping God in the manner and the season most agreeable to the dictates of his own conscience. So you get a very similar vibe as to what the Virginians did later down the road in the Massachusetts Bill of Rights. And then it's interesting is that in Article 3, it lays out, again, this is Article 3 of their Bill of Rights, lays out that the happiness of a people and the good order and preservation of civil government essentially depend upon piety, religion, and morality. Now, some of the other quotes we've had from Adams, you're like, oh yeah, I can see his voice in that. And it even goes further at that point to say that the people are to encourage the state legislature to kind of, as the state legislators or the government of the state, to then encourage the cities to provide for religious education. Now, it's at their own expense, meaning not the state's not going to pay for this. But it's interesting to see that they're kind of saying, we want to have freedom of religion. At the same time, we want to acknowledge that there is this necessity of this, again, moral and virtue foundation. And in one sense, you can see I'm probably deeply impacted by Adams, but I think Massachusetts is doing a lot of what we're saying was done nationally, that there's the both and. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So actually, in the state constitution itself, which continues from that point, the only thing is that the governor and the lieutenant governor did have to declare himself of the Christian religion. So they're in that group, Massachusetts is, that says that there is an expectation of the highest elected officers. Now here, it's only these two positions that say that. What and how they were going to know that, I don't know. I don't know if there was an election and somebody said, you're not a Christian, and then that somehow made them defunct in the opportunity. But nonetheless, that was the kind of thing. But in closing, they also said there should be no one denomination somehow elevated over another. So they've obviously moved, in the land of the Puritans, they've moved away from the kind of narrow strictness of enforcing the religion to a place of this openness for all the kind of denominations as they go along. All right, so the state constitutions give us this picture. They show us that there's a lot of variety, but Christianity is very important, and at some of the states, it is highly enshrined in the story. All right, you with me so far?
Yes, I am.
So this takes us to then Philadelphia. So if having told you that, and then I said they're going to write a constitution, you probably could think, I know the direction this is going to go.
Yeah. Yeah, they're specifically saying to different degrees. Christianity is it. But within that, having said that, we would like to make a lot of room for different expressions of that.
Right.
But explicitly, implicitly, obviously Christianity is the name of the game here.
Right.
So, yes, you see strains of that. So, yes, if we were going to do something nationally, you would say, well, let's follow where these trajectories are going. And
Right.
it seems pretty clear where it would be
Exactly.
headed to maybe clean that up and codify it and reconcile these
Yep.
things.
We could say they wrote the Articles of Confederation, and now as they've done the state things, state leaders and all the citizens are saying, you know what, that wasn't clear enough. We need to really get Christianity in there. We need to say, and probably Protestant Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what happened.
Yeah. Plot twist.
It's and this is again the frustration I think for my Christian conservative. And again, we've said this. You and I are both Christians, and I understand the wish and the. It'd be nice to tell a story of the Pilgrims, and then the Pilgrims, of course, wanting to establish a Christian nation, and then fast forward, we write a document, the Constitution, and that's enshrined. And in particular, taking Winthrop's ideas and what the Puritans did, which was certainly more strict than the Pilgrims, who, of course, had opened themselves up to include the non-Christians in their government. The Puritans, we would have fixed all that kind of stuff. It's just fascinating to me when you look at it. And when you examine what was done in Philadelphia with the Constitution, they really don't talk about religion at all. It's like it's not part of the conversation. Now, minds that believe in conspiracies could say, oh, I know what happened. The kind of secularist, the Enlightenment-minded people like Jefferson, they coordinated all the elections, so only non-Christian losers came to Philadelphia.
Yeah.
Nope, that did not happen at all.
So it wasn't discussed. It's not like it was discussed and it was not in the final mix. It really
They
was not a big part of the discussion. Period.
They just never really thought that was an important thing to bring into the government.
Yeah.
They knew about it, obviously.
Right.
Now, one thing I need to hasten to say is one of the decisions that was made by Madison early was that the meetings would be held in secret. And they were very protective of this. This fed their opponents who were saying, hey, treason is happening. These guys are trying to overthrow the government, which was true. And they're terrible people, which that's a whole different conversation. and so, look, they're doing things in secret. So that meant there's nobody who was there as the secretary taking notes. So all we have are the notes and the reflections by various leaders.
Okay.
So it's not a complete record. However, we do have enough notes that had someone said, hey, in my state, we do this. In this state, we do that. It would have been noted. And Madison was there. Jefferson's in Paris. He's not there. But Madison and probably Alexander Hamilton and others certainly would have been vociferous in their opposition. They would have been right out in front. And there were others who did think, or I should say, who were Christians. There's comments and notes in that time period. They were there for, I think, about 6 months of the different ones of them going to church and being active in church. And they look for moments, on July 4th, they basically pay for religious citywide service, and not a celebration with fireworks, but a pastor coming and giving a sermon and preaching. So there's a sense of which there's enough Christianity in the room that if they wanted to follow the trajectory that would seem like the state constitutions were leading us to, they could have, and they didn't.
They didn't.
So at the end, when you read through the document, there's just really nothing there. There is, I think, they're being guided by this concern of these growing stories of persecution about religious groups. There was at this point a small but growing Jewish community in the middle colonies, so New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania. And so now you've got a large enough citizenry who are not Christian at all. And yet, what are you going to do with these people? And some of them were making appeals at different times to say, hey, we want to be good citizens. We want to be included. We think we will be good citizens. Don't exclude us in the story. And if you look at the document, in Article 6 of the Constitution, there is an oath of office, or a statement about taking the oath of office. And in it, it specifically says this, I'm quoting now, no religious test shall ever be required as qualification. So clearly they had considered what was happening at the state level. they're not saying we don't want Christianity, but they are saying we don't think it needs to be enshrined in our governing documents. In one sense, what we're seeing here then, and maybe I'm jumping to the conclusion ahead of time, but in one sense, I think it was episode 4 or 5, where we extolled all the positive things that Christianity brought to the table. The idea that we today will call separation of church and state, the separation at the governing level between ideas and ideologies of religious intent or philosophies and the governing edifice itself should be separate, that comes from Christianity itself. Christianity offers this in. A lot of that really picks up speed after the Reformation. So when you have these variations of what we call denominations today of the Christian faith, and there had been moments when those had clashed during the Reformation, leading to the quote-unquote religious wars, which quite honestly is a poorly titled, poor title for the event of what was going on from, say, 1550 to 1650. But nonetheless, and you can see our founders in particular saying, yeah, we don't want that. And you can see people in Europe saying this, and you'll begin to get this movement happening in other nations, other states, of saying, yeah, I think Maryland has this right. They wrote that in 1649. I think that's the way we need to go, in that we need to allow the space for a citizen to have this. But this comes from this idea of the Christians saying that the religion, the philosophical faith, and the political entity, the governing system makers, they need to be separated at least at some level. And remember, the historical norm is that they're woven together. They're tightly together. And again, most people from antiquity, wherever we pull them up from the planet, if we went back to Doc Brown, they would look at you and me and they'd say, why wouldn't you want your God or gods involved in decision making? And we'd have to answer them. I think there is an answer. And part of the answer would be what we just said about Virginia. I don't personally want to live in a place where someone who differs from me on matters of spirit, even to the point of saying that there are no matters of spirit, taking what we would typically broadly call an atheistic position, that somehow they are banished from society, impacted civically in society, or even worse, beaten or jailed, for that position.
Right.
Yeah, it's Now, please understand that the reserve about faith, the fact that it's not in the document, notice what's not in the document: a positive statement about we're going to be this religion, nor what Massachusetts put in their document, or what Virginia later established, the idea of, there should be a tolerance protection about quote-unquote matters of conscience. So both those things were problematic.
Yeah.
And critics began to notice it right off the bat. Say, whoa, this isn't very good. The group that was troubled that they wanted the government to give faith a larger role will be embedded in the opponents of the Constitution. It's not the only reason there were opponents of the Constitution, but they certainly were in the mindset of saying, wait a minute, there's no religious test and there should be. And they wanted at least for the government to say in its governing documents that there should be support for religious education. They seeing religious education, as we've said in earlier episodes, as a necessary tool.
Foundation to the whole thing.
Right. That we saw the Athenians do this. We saw the Romans do this. The idea of we need to teach people what's kind of, in our mix as we go along. The other groups, again, there's two groups that were troubled about their lack of statement about faith. One who wanted to give a larger role, and one that feared the government would take a larger role because there's nothing in the document denying them the opportunity. So this latter group would have been amongst the critics who wanted there to be amendments in what we eventually come to know as our Bill of Rights. And this battle will show up in ratification because every state that voted positively. So when it's all said and done in ratification, 11 states ratify the Constitution. So when George Washington's elected, he's really the president of an 11-state nation, not 13 states. The two that voted no are North Carolina and Rhode Island. And it wasn't clear what was going to happen, but in essence, day one of Washington's presidency, you'd have to think I'm dealing with these two places as a foreign entity.
It's so interesting.
Yeah.
That's a nuance I did not really understand was there.
Yeah, North Carolina in particular was really interested and concerned about the rights. And after the Bill of Rights is passed, they largely will go, okay, we're cool, and they will have another ratification vote and pass. Rhode Island's a totally different story, and we don't have time to really get into it, but they go for almost 2 years. And within Rhode Island itself, there's some division, and people are realizing economically this is going to harm us. If we're going to be America's Luxembourg, this is going to be tough. It's going to be tough to pull this off. What will the relationship be? And there was some threat from the U.S. Congress, basically not a physical war, but an economic war. We're going to punish you, and we won't play nice with you. We won't let you be Luxembourg. And so eventually Rhode Island gives in about 2 years in. Unhappy with the story as they found it in that sense there, but eventually they, as you know, they will write and pass a Bill of Rights. Madison, so the thing gets ratified, right, and then there's elections nationwide for the new Congress. Madison wants to be in the House of Representatives. He almost loses his election, which was against, by the way, James Monroe.
Wow.
They're both kind of disciples of Jefferson, but at least initially they weren't on unfriendly terms. They just were competing for the same role. And there's some kind of neat stories in that election about them actually even spending the night together. We've gone to campaign at some place when they stay in the same hotel basically and are friendly. But in any case, he almost loses, which is interesting to think about what the government would have been like if Madison not been in Congress. But he doesn't lose. The reason he's being pressured is about the rights. And there were many Baptists in Virginia who had seen him as a champion. You helped us get this religious tolerance thing in. Now you did not protect us similarly at the national level. And so that, plus the many other rights, one of the big ones was the fact that there was nothing in the Constitution about how trials were be. So amendments 3, 4, and 5 really deal with, your right to jury, your all those things that we now kind of enshrine in our Miranda rights. That was not in there. And so they were getting attacked on that point. But in Virginia specifically, Madison is being pressured by the Baptist of like, where are the rights that we want to see? Certainly a right of protection in religion. And so when he does win his election because he begins to say, I'm going to make a change. I'm agreeing. We'll do some things with the amendments in the process. And he brings it in to make a law that would basically prohibit Congress, which we now call our First Amendment, that would protect it from respecting the creation of any establishment of religion. What's interesting is his take on it. So it's a longer story. We just don't have time for it. What we call our number 1 amendment was actually our third in the list. Yeah. Congress passed 12 amendments, and 1 and 2 were voted down. So we always think the First Amendment, because it was the most important, it's prime. Nope, it was third.
It was third.
And in Madison, when he wrote out, here's the amendments we need to put in, the fourth one was about religion. And he said this: the civil rights of none shall be abridged on account of religious belief or worship, nor shall any national religion be established, nor shall the full and equal rights of conscience be in any manner or under any pretext infringed. So that, of course, eventually all gets worked into our First Amendment, which, we know basically in that process, which we don't have to dig into the depths of what it says and kind of parse out the words or anything. But the point for us is we can see the concern that the Constitution did not speak one way or the other, really kind of brought up the tension there in the mix. Yeah.
So interesting.
Yeah, it's a different journey than you would think, because you would think they're going to move from the states, from articles to states, to the states to the new government, and the new government would be the opportunity to kind of do what most of the other states did. And instead they said, no, we don't want to do that. We want to blend it.
Yeah.
And that, again, I want to make sure it's not to say that the Christian ethos is being rejected. Congress will establish itself like the articles did with the chaplain. I mentioned that there wasn't a lot of religion like discussed in Philadelphia. Franklin, at one point, they were getting really tense in about a couple of months in, in the summer, and they were getting stuck on what would eventually be solved by the Great Compromise. So Ben Franklin, makes a speech saying, you know what we haven't done? We haven't prayed. So let's go get a chaplain in here to pray. So it's not like we need to have a chaplain in the document. It's not like, you know what we haven't done? We haven't put God into the document. It doesn't say that.
Yeah.
It's just, here's Ben Franklin, who's not often held up as a paragon of Christian virtue, saying, I know that the Christian ethos is important. I Franklin believe, God is watching. He said, we have not once of humbly applying to the capital Father of lights to illuminate our understandings. And he said, we prayed in 1776, and he said, our prayers were answered. So he's like, we need to do this. And he makes a very famous quote that is often held up as a statement. It's worth hearing. The longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. He meant affairs of humans.
Yes.
And he meant the Christian God. It's what he's talking about there. The idea of having a chaplain come in was opposed, but like I said, the compromise at that moment wasn't about the document. It was like, well, what should we do here? Hey, July 4th's coming. Let's pay for out of our own money. We'll all pool our resources, and we'll have like a celebration for the city that includes a sermon by a pastor. So they do that kind of a thing. And when you look at the government as it whirled out, Washington, Adams, Madison, and Monroe all have days of fasting and prayer that they call for national days of fasting and prayer. Jefferson doesn't, and he tells why in some letters, and it's a very famous letter to Baptists back in Virginia, but he basically says, hey, look, that's really something that should be done at the state level, not the national level. I'm not opposed to Virginia having a state day of prayer, but he's the only one. But he was not, somehow opposed to Christianity, in the mix. And so you look and you can see, again, this point we've been raising, that Christianity is embedded in the ethos, but it's not fundamentally put in to create kind of a Christian nation. It's a lot for you to chew on, and we'll pause for a second.
Yeah.
And see if you have anything you want to throw in
Yeah,
there.
well, it makes me wonder if it was not important to them, or it was so important that they maybe foresaw, if we establish a specific religion, we know governments kind of go sideways eventually. Is this too important to put into their hands to administer?
Yeah.
Let's just make room and we'll figure it out on the personal level, but we don't want any kind of dictates from a top-down kind of thing, because the government's working now, but let's not give them this put this weapon in their tool in their hands that could become a weapon.
Yeah, and I think that message, that's a good insight on your part, that idea really filters back down. So you begin to see the states changing their constitutions in the decades to come, in the early 1800s, and they will all remove any religious action, any statements of any oaths of office, to where they will match themselves much more to the national. And this is pre-Hollywood. This is pre-leftism. This is them saying, as Christians, you know what? We do have a healthy myriad of religious stances. And by the time you get into the early 1800s, you even have other non-Christian religious minority groups showing up in small numbers. 1840s, you've got a large population of people coming from Asia, bringing what we would call broadly, the Asian religious viewpoint into the western part of the country. So they're seeing the kind of wisdom of the point you just made there.
Wow.
So let me just wrap it up.
Yeah.
And kind of make some points here. In the earliest days of the colonies, we see Christianity as central, joined by the other three themes that I've said. By the time of its founding, both the philosophical founding and the eventual government of the Constitution in 1788, Christianity played a crucial role, but was not centralized, as one might expect. Instead, especially with the Constitution, much like you just mentioned, the Americans actually took a radical step to intentionally not include any statement about God or religion, even though the states often did and Christianity was central. This is not, though, a rejection of Christianity or of religion more broadly. It's one that you can see the foundation of many of the founders, and again, I mean the 2 million men and women were Christian, And the overall sense of law for the land was assumed to be matched or guided by their blended understanding of natural law we talked about, that was in the Declaration, in a world controlled or guided or shepherded by God. Adams, again, writes, we've already said this one before in another podcast, but it's worth repeating, that this style of government without a central king or all-powerful leader at the top is only to be supported by pure religion and austere morals. Public virtue cannot exist in a nation without private, and he means private virtue, and public virtue is the only foundation of republics. So yet again, we need to be careful to note how these same leaders were certain to leave the impact of religion or Christianity more specifically as foundational, not imposed. You have other leaders who we've already said may or may not be the quote unquote paragon of Christian high quality. Somebody like Franklin, as already noted, can be criticized. Washington sometimes considered himself, people say, well, he was just a deist, which is fine. But there's also these kind of open callings by them to the almighty being, which is their way of saying the Christian God, but again, not seeking to impose a faith on the nation. The two competing ideas, that there's this idea of the Christian foundation and yet not imposed on us. The idea that for the system to work, needing this religious or spiritual, better way for me to put it today, spiritual foundation of moral to support morals and virtue. Those two competing ideas were both true for the nation's own understanding of itself. Christian principles blended with natural law, placing a Christian flavor within the national foundation, and yet with intentionality, no declared specific striving to be or become a Christian nation. Now, it's interesting, fast forward about 3 decades. Alexis de Tocqueville very famously comes to the United States and visits and writes all about all his experiences. And he noted how religion, and again, remember in this context, we're thinking religion is really the Christian faith, was central to our style of government, but that equally the Americans were already on their way to replacing that God with the love of money. So he's seeing the two, capitalism and Christianity, kind of being those twin peaks there. So this is a quote from him. One cannot say that in the United States, religion exerts an influence on the laws or on the details of public opinions, but it directs the mores. And it is in regulating the family that religion, works to regulate the state.
Very prescient.
Yeah, very prescient. And so we come to the end of our journey looking at what was so unique in that foundation. And as I said at the kickoff of this episode, what we'll do next time is you and I will just continue our conversation, but without any specific historical moment to say, well, with this information, let's come back to the early 21st century. What can we offer? And they will just be offerings. Again, I don't have behind door number 3 the magic solution and pick me because that's the. But I know people want me to have that. I've had people already tell me that. In some of the comments of the podcast, like, what's the answer? And it's like, we're going to offer some suggestions, but at the same time, we're going to acknowledge the limit of our own insights and see what we can glean out of what we've been looking at.
I can't wait.
All right, we'll see you next time.
See ya.
Thanks for joining us on Unmoored, America Adrift in Historical Forgetfulness and Finding Our Way Back. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. If you have any questions or comments, drop an email to carl@carlkreisman.com. This episode was produced and edited by Carl Kreisman and recorded at the Winter Park Public Library. The Winter Park Library promotes the free and open exchange of ideas and does not attempt to control or take responsibility for any opinions that may be expressed in this podcast. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not constitute or imply an endorsement or reflection of the library's policies or beliefs. Our theme music was written and performed by Kyle Williams. A big thank you to everyone who supports the show. And if you'd like to help, visit carlkreisman.com/unmoored.